thank you for being here. It's so good to see such a big crowd. Let's begin with a word of prayer. Almighty God, we thank you for your many gifts. We thank you for bringing us here. We pray that in our time together, by learning about what you did in the land you created and placed your people in, that we would learn more about you. We pray in Christ's name. Amen. Amen. Hey, y'all come on in. That's all right. I prayed y'all in. So, here, let's get y'all a couple of chairs here.
Okay.
Take that.
There's two right over there.
Wait, here, we can get these right here.
This is good.
These came already unfolded. So I'll alter the room setup a little bit for next week. Make it a little more user-friendly. Last time we had just enough people to sit around the table. So 22. Hey, y'all.
It's pouring in here.
21 plus 4 is 25. Okay. I have a liberal arts degree. I could write you a poem about 25 days. I could do it math with it. Oh, excuse me. Could you squeeze in over there? Sure. Or you could, y'all could come sit right here.
Okay.
And there's room in there.
The next two people can sit.
And you said there's two more people coming up the wall?
Maybe.
All right, well, they'd be here by now. All right. So I don't want to review last time, but I told the folks what I did is I did get a map. This is the map that I carried around with me last time I was there. So it's not exactly big enough to see or read or know anything about from the back of the room, but it is, at least you can hopefully you can sort of get an idea of what we were talking about. And I'll talk about the point where we are. Tonight we're all going to be up here anyway, so it doesn't matter. I did find these maps that I may try to trot out over in the other building, but I think they were bought a little bit before my grandparents were born. So I joke that Turkey on there still shows up as the Ottoman Empire, so it's kind of old. Thank y'all. I made that joke earlier today and nobody laughed. So, yes, no history buffs in the earlier group. But so just to kind of broad strokes what we talked about last time, the things we'll talk about over and over. In the north of the country you have the Galilee, which usually we call up the Golan Heights, which were not part of the state of Israel in 1948 when it was created, but Israel got after the 6 Days War in 1967. So you've got the Galilee, the Golan Heights. The central hill country kind of runs as a spine like this. It includes Samaria and Jerusalem at the kind of bottom of what historic Samaria, even though it's not really Samaria. The Mediterranean Sea. Here you have Tel Aviv. So you see Tel Aviv is actually kind of halfway in the middle of the country. And here's Jerusalem. The vast majority of Israel's population is right here, right on the coast. Jerusalem, modern city of about 800,000 people. So like what you think of the walls, that's only a tiny little piece of the city of Jerusalem. The Judean desert here, the Negev desert here, the Sinai desert here. Here, the very bottom of Israel just barely gets to the Red Sea. We did not get that far. It's not real safe if you go that far, and plus there's nothing between here and here but a whole bunch of desert. So around it you have Egypt, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon. And you have the Sea of Galilee. There's actually a very small lake up here where the River Jordan rises, feeds into the Sea of Galilee, flows south into the Dead Sea. Now if you look in your back of your Bible, for example, you'll see the Dead Sea. All this white isn't here, but I mentioned to you now so much water has been taken out of the Jordan that the Dead Sea is drying up, sort of. So all this right here used to be water, and now there's basically really two seas with a canal that joins them to make sure. And Jordan, which is this side, and Israel actually sort of have a partnership about how they're trying to do something about it. Hopefully they do. So we mentioned this is all, the nation of Israel is what's in green. The Palestinian territories are what's in the bright lighter color here. The West Bank actually kind of goes around like this. It just includes Jerusalem and comes around. It actually comes a little lower. But what you see I don't want to get political yet, but as you see, Israel's already taken some of that. It should be like this if it were following the treaties from before, the treaties that are actually still in force and just not enforced. And the Gaza Strip. If you'll remember, Jordan was here. It would make sense then that Jordan would administer the West Bank and Egypt, the Gaza Strip. The Gaza Strip, of course, is in the West Bank. Try not to think they have two different governments. It's supposed to be one government, one people, but you have a legitimate government in the West Bank, and you have Hezbollah in the Gaza Strip, which is a terrorist organization. So basically, warlords run the Gaza Strip. All right, so we're not going to really talk. This is Beersheba, you hear in the Bible. We didn't go that far south. We really didn't go any further south than about right here. Actually, we did. We went south and then we went around like this to get to the lower part of the Dead Sea. But so basically, Beersheba is where it's not real safe, so we didn't go there. All right, so quick geography, and we'll talk about history. Is anybody else hot?
Yeah.
Hey, I'm going to turn the thermostat down.
It's so cold now. Because I love the windows.
Oh, Mike's already on. All right, so we're going to start with the trip. So this is the Newark Airport, which is probably the best airport in that part of New Jersey. I'm not making a New Jersey joke, I promise. But it was kind of neat. I've never been to New York City, and as we're landing in Newark, I'm looking at the Manhattan skyline, and I'm real smart. Y'all know that. So I'm like, what's that green thing down there sticking up out in the water? It was the Statue of Liberty. So I saw the Statue of Liberty for the first time. Yeah, I told y'all I was smart. So that's some of us who are on the trip. There's some of us who aren't in that picture, but there's Mike, who's sitting in the back of the room. Nipes, y'all were off in the lounge, the United Airlines VIP area, I believe. But that's just some of us. There were others of us, obviously. That's just one picture I found. That's the wing of the airplane that took us to the Holy Land. They had a place for me to put one little skinny picture. So when we landed, the first place we landed in Tel Aviv, here. And then we drove to Tiberias, here at the Sea of Galilee. Now bear in mind, this looks like a whole country, but it's only about, you can almost see across it. I mean, not really, but it's a small country. So it's only a couple hour drive from Tel Aviv to Tiberias on the Sea of Galilee, which is right here. I don't really have any pictures of Tiberias. Tiberias is a historic city, but there's really not much historical to see there. If you think of sort of what a beach resort a lake town beach resort sort of place might have looked like in the mid-'80s, and you've got Tiberias. I don't know why it seems to be situated in the mid to late 80s, but that's what it looks like. And the best food we had, hotel food anyway, was in Tiberias. We stayed at a family-run hotel. Anyway. But, so just a little bit about Tiberias, just so you know. Like I said, I really don't have any pics. It was there was a Roman city there. The Roman city was built there around 17 to 20 AD. And it became, after the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple, and all the Jews were exiled from that part of what is Judea, after they revolted against the Romans, Tiberias, for the Emperor Tiberius, emerged as the center for rabbinical study. So whenever Jewish rabbis whenever Jewish men, and of course they were all men then, wanted to learn how to be a rabbi, that's where they'd go. And so in 235 AD, what we would call a seminary was established there. A rabbinical school was established there and remained there for most of a long time, really until the Muslim conquest. Some centuries later. So Tiberias is a Roman city. And so, for example, you sometimes, in John, I believe, you see the Sea of Galilee called the Sea of Tiberias. And it is right there in the middle of the Sea of Galilee. So it was the major city on the Sea of Galilee after it was built. A couple of things I meant to say before I looked at my notes. We're going to talk, when we talk about the sites we visited, there are some sites that are the traditional sites where something happened, and there are some sites that have been historically proven to be the place where something happened. if you remember, I don't think I said this before, but around the year 300, when the Roman Emperor Constantine became a Christian, he sent his mother, who was already a Christian, to the Holy Land to identify the holy sites. And her methodology was not that complicated. She just went to a place, and for example, we're going to talk about where Jesus had preached the Sermon on the Mount. So she went and said, where did Jesus preach the Sermon on the Mount? They said, well, that hill over there. And so she would mark it, and that was now the Mount of Beatitudes. She went to Jerusalem. Where was Jesus crucified? That hill over there. She would mark it. Now that's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. So those are, when we talk about traditional sites, just because it's the traditional site and it hasn't been historically proven, doesn't mean it's not necessarily the site. And I also think there's something important about being in the traditional site, even if it's not the exact piece of real estate where something happened. Maybe it's 1,000 yards this way or a mile up the road. There's still, you're able, when you're in the site, it's been, the way I think of it, saturated with centuries of prayers, where the Holy Spirit is always present, whether we're there or not, you get something out of it. But most of even the traditional sites, we can't say historically, archaeologically for certain this is where it happened. But what we can say is that as early as around the year 300, Christians who were here were already revering this site as the place where this thing happened. So that gets then at what I'm talking about with the name of the class, the name of the series, which is In the Footsteps of God. You know, as Christians, we of course believe that Jesus is God. Jesus is God in the flesh when he was on earth. He was God in the flesh. That's called incarnation. And so if you walk where Jesus walked, you walk where God walked. And that gets to the idea of pilgrimage. It does something to us to go, to be there, to reminisce. I don't know if it's some of us. I know if you were especially in love with where you went to college, for example, like I am. I can go to Wofford if I'm up near Spartanburg. I'll just pull off. I'll park in a visitor spot because I know they won't tow your car, even if you don't have a sticker. And I'll just walk around campus. And some things look the same, and some things look different, and some things are gone. And the freshmen this year are quite literally within reasonable range to be old enough to be my child. But still, it's in the being there, in the walking around, I connect with a piece of me that I don't connect with any other time. Going to the Holy Land kind of does the same thing. In visiting those places, you are, whether they're the actual places or not, even if they look different than they did 2,000 years ago or earlier, you're still able to connect, I think, spiritually with God through that action. So hence the name of the class. All right, so we stayed in Tiberias for a couple of nights, and so what we're going to look about tonight is things sort of around the Sea of Galilee that we visited. And this is the area of the Galilee is where Jesus probably spent the most time as far as his earthly ministry. We'll talk about Nazareth in a moment, well, actually next week, where Jesus was from. But Jesus really didn't have a lot of his ministry in Nazareth. As we'll read, Jesus got run off from Nazareth for daring to call himself the Messiah. And when he did, he went to the area of the Galilee. And most of his ministry, most of what we read about in the Gospels, happened around the Galilee until he, the King James Version, set his eyes toward Jerusalem. And so the Gospels basically give us, most of it's the ministry around the Sea of Galilee, the journey to Jerusalem, and then what happened in Jerusalem. So we'll look at some stuff around the Sea of Galilee. So the first place we went was the Mount of Beatitudes. Now this is the mountain. See y'all? All right. This is the mountain where Jesus preached the Sermon on the Mount. And the Beatitudes are part of the Sermon on the Mount, sort of the first thing he said, and I thought we'd look at those together. And you'll find that in Matthew 5, verses 1 through 12. Matthew 5, 1 through 12. Now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up a mountain. He sat down, and his disciples came to him. He taught them, saying, "Happy are people who are hopeless, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are people who grieve, because they will be made glad. Happy are people who are humble, because they will inherit the earth. Happy are people who are hungry and thirst for righteousness, because they will be fed until they are full. Happy are people who show mercy, because they will receive mercy. Happy are people who have pure hearts, because they will see God. Happy are people who make peace, because they will be called God's children. Happy are people whose lives are harassed, because they are righteous, because the kingdom of heaven is theirs. Happy are you when people insult and harass you and speak all kinds of bad and false things about you because of me. Be full of joy and be glad, because you have a great reward in heaven. In the same way, people harass the prophets who came before you. So this is taken from the top of the Mount of Beatitudes, looking out over onto the Sea of Galilee. And you'll see in a minute why it would. And Jesus goes on in the Sermon on the Mount to, now, of course, every minister has his or her own sort of biases as what they think is important. But I think if you were to encapsulate sort of Jesus' moral teaching into just a few chapters, well, 3 chapters of the Bible, it would be Matthew 5 through 7, which is the Sermon on the Mount. That doesn't mean everything that's important is in those, but the moral teaching, beginning with the Beatitudes, the first thing he said, the Lord's Prayer is found there. The business about loving your neighbors loving your enemies and loving those who persecute, praying for those who persecute you is in the Sermon on the Mount. I have to be careful. I would just preach the Sermon on the Mount over and over and over again. But this is a picture from the top of the Mount of Beatitudes. Now, it's interesting. You do see things I mentioned to you before. The Galilee area, the Galilee is lush, and you see things growing. This is an olive grove. This is a field. That's some kind of plant of some sort. There's another view from the top there, looking down. I think that's back toward Tiberias. Oh, actually, this valley right here that you see going up that way, that's called the Valley of the Wind. And it's basically, there's a Roman road that runs through there that Jesus actually would have traveled as when he came from Nazareth, about 70 miles to Capernaum, which we'll talk about in a minute. But this is there, if you can't see it in the picture, but there are little caves all in this canyon wall where early monks would go and become hermits, even though there was a bunch of them. And one of the neat little things that happen when you read about in the Bible, for example, windstorms that just strike up on the Sea of Galilee. This what's here is sort of like a canyon, kind of gradually slopes up until you get to Nazareth. And what a little gust of wind in Nazareth can catch itself in this canyon and go all this valley, and this serves like a funnel that just shoots all that wind here onto the Sea of Galilee. So when you read about frequent, it's actually even though you can see across it, and it's calm water usually, these weird windstorms can come up and make it a dangerous place to sail. Now, I mentioned how it goes down that. I should mention too, the River Jordan is in the Rift Valley, the lowest point on earth being the Dead Sea. So the Great Rift Valley in Africa, it starts in Africa and Ethiopia and runs up under the Red Sea, and it comes back up and becomes the Jordan River Valley. So we're dealing with everything basically is up from there. Now, you can sort of get a sense of it in this picture, but the Mount of Beatitudes creates, gets a natural, it basically creates a natural amphitheater. So Jesus could stand not far enough, high up, but low enough that he had a backdrop, as it were, as it kind of curves, and he could speak, and the natural acoustics would be such that thousands of people would be able to hear him. Plus, people weren't used to amplified speech, so I think people would have been able to hear it better anyway. This is the church that's at the top of the Mount of Beatitudes. This building was built in 1938. It's not far from a 4th century church that venerated that site. Now, I think I've said before, maybe in different settings, but just so we're clear, that the way that ancient Christians went about honoring holy sites is they would knock down all those pesky ruins that were there and build a church on top of it. And this isn't exactly built on ruins, but it is built at near the top of the Mount of Beatitudes. And it's a beautiful church. I've got some interior pictures I'll show you in a minute. Some things I would point out about it. It's built, I'll wait till you show the interior of it. But it is now, there's a French convent there. So many of the sites in the Holy Land are, well, I think pretty much all but a few are either the property of various types of Orthodox, Greek, or Russian, or a Roman Catholic order. Most of the sites belong to the Order of St. Francis, Franciscans. But some of them belong to other Catholic orders as well. And this one belongs to an order of French nuns. The only time I've ever been fussed at by a nun was there. I was too loud and she told me so. She's pretty nice about it. So that gives you a sense of the place. I'm going to step back so you can see. So that's looking, if you're standing sort of to the left of the church I just showed you, you're looking down the hill and you get another sense. And now here, this is Capernaum, all the way back to here. Actually, it goes further. It's just not excavated. And we'll talk more about Capernaum in a moment. But if you think of Capernaum as the home of Peter and Andrew, James and John, if you think about that as sort of Jesus' headquarters after he left Nazareth, we know that the Gospel seems to tell us he sort of lived in Capernaum, and probably in Peter's home. But we'll look at that in a minute. But you see then, if we're standing at the top of the Mount of Beatitudes looking down at Capernaum, you can kind of see where Jesus, if he were here and we read in this Gospels multiple times of Jesus going off to be alone to sort of pray and collect himself, he might just wander up this hill and then he'd realize that everybody had followed him and then he would turn around and teach them. So you get a sense of it kind of collapses the scale for me. This is a Greek Orthodox church that's there that's just beautiful that I have a picture of. You can't tour it. I was willing to convert just to go in and see it. Not really. But you get a sense of, I think, how it all sort of works together. And when you read the stories of the things that happened around Capernaum and the Sermon on the Mount. This is the interior of the Church of Beatitudes. This is the altar. And there's Jim and Anna kneeling, praying. And so it's a dome. I tried to get a picture of the dome. That's the best I could get. And this is a Catholic church, so it's a different dome theology, which I'll talk about in a minute. But the sermon, it's an octagonal, big octagon cube, and the altar's in the middle of it. And so then there are kneeling benches all the way around it, so that no matter where you are in the sanctuary, you're facing the altar and surrounding the altar. And I kind of like that idea. I thought if I ever designed a church, I like the idea of the altar, the place that represents where God is, being surrounded by the people of God. So sort of worship in the round. And you can even see how the steps where the altar is are four-sided, so there's no straight in or out. You can kind of see the mosaics. These are new mosaics. These are not ancient mosaics, but you can kind of see it has water symbolism in the mosaic. Stations of the Cross. If you've ever been in a Catholic church, they have like icons or statues around what's called the ambulatory, which is the area architecturally around. Did I get that right? Ambulatory. Okay, I'm checking with my art historian. So I like it. The roundness, the idea that there's no beginning, no end, and that everybody's together. And for me, when I went in 2008, it was standing on the Mount of Beatitudes and then going into this worship space that the first time I had the sense that Jesus was here, that I'm where Jesus had been. And it was better than walking around campus at Wofford. But the walking in the footsteps of God enabled me to connect with God here in a way that I'd not before. And did again when I went in over the summer. Oh, well, we'll talk about the boat in a minute. Do y'all have any questions about the Mount of Beatitudes before we move on to the church? All right. If you have questions, just holler them out. We don't have to be formal. All right, so you go a little bit further around the lake, around the Sea of Galilee, and you have the so-called Jesus boat. Now, in 1986, there was a drought, and the water level in the Sea of Galilee fell a bunch. And there were two brothers that lived in a kibbutz near what is, we believe to be biblical Magdala, which is Mary Magdalene, where she would have been from. So we think that kibbutz is more or less where Magdala was. So really, we're just talking a mile or so, maybe not that much, but a couple miles at most from from Capernaum. But anyway, so at this kibbutz in 1986, these two brothers were walking around in the mud, and they discovered the remains of this boat. This boat had been buried in the mud and therefore preserved. So they brought in, the Israeli government has an incredible government Department of Archaeology that takes seriously the role of preserving these sites and all these things, whether they're Jewish or not. And we don't know if this was a kosher boat or not, but they discovered this boat in the mud. It had to be, right? It had to be. This boat in the mud. It was excavated and not restored, but preserved as it was. And this is what it would have looked like, they think, in its heyday. Well, it didn't look like this. But interestingly about this boat dates from the time of Jesus. And there's a mosaic from around 70 AD with a boat that looks just like that. That's depicted as a Galilean Sea, everyday sort of person fishing boat. So when we think of, for example, Jesus in the boat and the draft of fish, when we think of, James and John mending their nets, they would have been mending their nets next to a boat like this. And so this boat, we know, now we don't know that this was Jesus' boat. We don't know that this was any of the disciples' boat, but we know this dates from the time of Jesus, and we know that it dates from the place where Jesus was. Interesting thing about this boat to me is it has 12 different kinds of wood in it. Now that doesn't mean that they knew that you needed this kind of wood at the top and this kind of wood for the keel and all these things. It was probably built out of one kind of wood, and as it started to leak, they mended it with what they had, and that process continued until you kind of had, if a shade tree mechanic got his hands on a 2,000-year-old shade tree boat mechanic, this is the result. But anyway, I think that's it's really neat to be able to see that and know that you're looking at something that not probably, but possibly Jesus could have seen this very boat. Maybe took a ride in it. We don't know. But it's interesting to me that we have that, and there's a whole museum dedicated to the boat.
So how big is this boat, Thomas?
20 feet maybe?
Yeah.
About 20 feet. I should have written that down, but I'd say it's about 20 feet. And a central mast. Would have had a square sail. So now this is metal that's holding the wood together. So this whole metal framework is keeping it together. And this is a floodgate here, so from time to time they have to get it wet again so it doesn't disintegrate. Interestingly, my brother works at a museum in Atlanta, and they have a dugout canoe from the Spanish that was found in South Georgia, buried in mud, that belonged to conquistadors. And it was funny because they actually did research on how they preserved the Jesus boat to preserve the
there's
Spanish.
a documentary on them digging it up.
Yeah,
I've seen it on PBS or somewhere.
it is. It's really neat if you can find it. I mean, the whole story of how they did it. I mean, we were impressed when they brought the Hunley up, but I mean, come on, this is 2,000 years old. You know? And this is Tiberias across the Sea of Galilee. Just kind of say it's kind of built up onto a hill. Next stop is going to be the Church of the Multiplication of Loaves and Fishes, or just the Church of Multiplication for easy math. This is the traditional site, again, not historically proven, but the traditional site of where Jesus fed the 5,000, where he multiplied the loaves and the fish. It's at a place, and it's a church, the next church we'll look at literally next door, though two sort of different properties, is at a place called Tabgha, which is an Arabic corruption of the Greek heptagon, which means 7 springs. So this is a place of 7 springs. But at Tabgha we have both the Church of the Multiplication and the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter, which we'll look at in a moment. So before we talk about the Church of the Multiplication, let's read that account, and let's look at Mark 6:30 through 44. Mark 6:30 through 44. Give you a minute. We're going to do storms. Did y'all ever have to race in Sunday school to see who could get it first? All right, Mark 6:30 through 44. I get back in screen. The apostles returned to Jesus and told him everything that they had done and taught. Many people were coming and going, so there was no time to eat. He said to the apostles, "Come by yourselves to a secluded place and rest for a while." They departed in a boat by themselves for a deserted place. Many people saw them leaving and recognized them, so they ran ahead from all the cities and arrived before them. When Jesus arrived and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. Then he began to teach them many things. Late in the day, his disciples came to him and said, "This is an isolated place, and it's already late in the day. Send them away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy something to eat for themselves." He replied, "You give them something to eat." But they said to him, "Should we go off and buy bread worth almost 8 months' pay and give it to them to eat?" He said to them, "How much bread do you have? Take a look." And checking, they said, 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. He directed the disciples to seat all the people in groups as though they were having a banquet on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and 50s. He took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, looked up to heaven, blessed them, broke the loaves into pieces, and gave them to his disciples to set before the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all. Everyone ate until they were full. They filled 12 baskets with the leftover pieces of bread and fish. About 5,000 had eaten. So this site is where we remember that. Now this church, before we talk more about it, this is a church that was built in 1982, but it's a replica of the church that stood on this site built in the 4th century. You're going to find a lot of the original things built in the 4th century because it was then that St. Helena, Constantine's mother, was going around identifying the holy sites. So the church that was here was destroyed at one of the wars that happened, and this church was built in 1982 in its place. But it's interesting to me that since they built it in 82, they made an intentional effort to make it look like the original church, or as much as we can know, as a replica of the original church. Now, this gives you a sense, when you walked into the church, before the church proper, so if you go back one, this is the church, and then there's a courtyard here with a cloister around it. And that would have been typical for a church of this time. For one thing, it sort of served as a wall of protection, so that people didn't just run right into the church. You could close this off, particularly if it were a monastic church, that you would be able to have some real seclusion. This is inside the courtyard. This is one of the springs, and this is an olive tree that's growing in the courtyard. There are olive trees just everywhere, but olive trees are hard to kill. Olive trees were considered almost miraculous, because it doesn't matter how much you prune back an olive tree, if there's any bit of root left, it'll grow back. And when we look at the Garden of Gethsemane, we'll see some 2,000-year-old, and actually older than 2,000-year-old olive trees. But so this is an ancient olive tree that is in the courtyard. And you see the cloisters, the curvy walk around, and then there's a monastic building here and the church here. And this is a view of the nave. So if you think of, we don't just make up church words. So when you walk into the back of a church, architecturally, you're standing in the narthex. It's a place where there's no seating. That's why we call that part of our church a narthex. I didn't just make that up. That's actual architectural term. And the center of the church, where the people would sit, is the nave. And this area to the sides is called an ambulatory. So you ambulated around it. You could walk around it. And then the end is the apse. This is a perfect replica of a Byzantine church, which would have had those components, which were picked up on and used in the West as well. You see the rounded arches, which would be of Byzantine architecture. One of the practical reasons of the apse, where the altar is being curved like that, is it served as a sounding board. So you could stand, the priest could stand here and be heard. And this one, in keeping with the Byzantine design, you don't have those big 3 preacher chairs like every church has. You know, it's big 3 wooden. We only have 2 big wooden preacher chairs, but this is basically a bench that runs around the back where all the clergy and others participating in the service would have sat, and then a throne in the middle for the bishop. Even if the bishop wasn't there in an Orthodox church, the bishop would still have had a throne. You still have a throne for the bishop, so he has somewhere to sit when he gets there. If you go to the Greek Orthodox church on the downtown, there's a bishop's throne, but it only gets sat in if the bishop's there. You know what the bishop's throne is called, by the way? It's called a cathedra. Like cathedral. The cathedral is the church where the bishop's throne is in the West. Eastern churches, everyone has a throne. And you see these icons, which again, even though this is a Western church, this is a Franciscan church, I believe, keeping in touch with the more Eastern Greek influence, you have icons where instead of stained glass windows or statues, what would be more common would be icons, stylized pictures of Jesus and the saints, which I love to see. I love those. So you can see here, though, these mosaics. You can't see it very clearly, but these mosaics on the floor are from the 4th century church. They were able to preserve those. And I'll show you the mosaics a little more clearly. That one didn't come out well. But, so, see, I showed that one. Even though it's blurry, it's going to make sense. So this is one of the most common. I have a small communion set with this on there. I think every minister who goes to the Holy Land comes away with a multiplication communion set. But see, here's a basket, the 2 fish, a basket with 4 loaves. I'll talk about that in a minute. And you can see other mosaics around it. This rock is held to be the rock where Jesus actually used as a table to bless the loaves and the fish. And the altar, you see, is built directly over the rock. Now, there's only 4 loaves in the basket. The scripture tells us there were 5 loaves. Who knows where the 5th loaf is?
Underneath it.
It's on the altar.
Oh.
When you celebrate communion, the bread of Holy Communion is the 5th loaf for the picture. I think that's kind of cool. It connects the story with us. It amazes me that in the 300s, this artist could conceptualize the idea that artistically to represent Christ's presence with us by making the 5th loaf of the mosaic the loaf used for communion. That's just neat to me. So there's other mosaics in the church that are noteworthy. There's a different picture. You can see the rock a little more clearly, and see the benches I mentioned in the apse. This is other mosaics that you can't walk on, but interestingly, you see Greek writing. You see these birds here are birds of the Nile. So there was a sense there was an Egyptian influence there, or a sense that this is a church that the whole world would come to. Because these are Nile water birds. These are not birds that are indigenous to the Holy Land. So, literally next door is the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter. The current church dates from 1935 and was also built on the ruins of a 4th century church. But 35, and this was not attempted to be a replica of the 4th century church. But let's look again in the scripture. Let's look at John 21, 1 through 19. John 21, 1 through 19. This is a little bit longer bit, but it's going to make sense with the things we're going to see. John 21, 1 through 19. Later, Jesus himself appeared again to his disciples at the Sea of Tiberias. This is how it happened. See, John calls it the Sea of Tiberias instead of Sea of Galilee. Simon Peter, Thomas called Didymus, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, Zebedee's sons, and 2 other disciples were together. Simon Peter told them, "I'm going fishing." They said, "We'll go with you." They set out in a boat, but throughout the night they caught nothing. Early in the morning, Jesus stood on the shore, but the disciples didn't realize it was Jesus. Jesus called to them, "Children, have you caught anything to eat?" They answered him, "No." He said, "Cast your net on the right side of the boat and you'll find some." So they did, and there were so many fish they couldn't haul in the net. Then the disciple whom Jesus loved said to Peter, "It's the Lord." When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he wrapped his coat around himself, for he was naked, and jumped into the water. The other disciples followed in the boat, dragging the net full of fish, for they weren't far from shore, only about 100 yards. When they landed, they saw a fire there, with fish on it and some bread. Jesus said to them, "Bring some of the fish that you've just caught." Simon Peter got up and pulled the net to shore. It was full of large fish, 153 of them. Yet the net hadn't torn, even with so many fish. Jesus said to them, "Come and have breakfast." None of the disciples could bring themselves to ask, "Who are you?" They knew it was the Lord. Jesus came, took the bread, and gave it to them. He did the same with the fish. This was now the third time Jesus appeared to his disciples after he was raised from the dead. When they finished eating, Jesus asked Simon Peter, "Simon, son of John, who do you love more than these?" Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my lambs." Jesus asked him a second time, Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Simon replied, "Yes, Lord, you know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Take care of my sheep." He asked him a third time, "Simon, son of John, do you love me?" Peter was sad that Jesus asked him a third time, "Do you love me?" He replied, "Lord, you know everything. You know I love you." Jesus said to him, "Feed my sheep. I assure you that when you were younger and you tied your own belt and walked around wherever you wanted, when you grow old, you will stretch out your hands and another will tie your belt and lead you where you don't want to go." He said this to show the kind of death by which Peter would glorify God. After saying this, Jesus said to Peter, "Follow me." So this church is where what we just read about happened, traditionally held to be on this site. Now the scripture we read is sort of a reconciliation between Peter and Jesus after the resurrection. Remember, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. And Peter felt like he was a failure, that he'd messed up, that it was long gone. And this is sort of thought of as a reconciliation. Not only that Jesus and Peter have their relationship restored, but that Jesus also gives Peter, depending on your theological bent, either leadership over the disciples or leadership over the church. And those who would hold that it sort of established Peter as a permanent leader of the church believe that the heir of Peter is the Pope. And so Catholics would point to this scripture as one of those where Jesus established a line of succession from Peter through all the popes to be head of the church. Obviously, I don't necessarily believe that interpretation, but I do believe it gave Peter a role as a leader among the disciples, probably the central core leader of the disciples in the early days of the church. Now, you see, throughout this part of the Galilee, there are these outcrops of limestone that come out everywhere. Buildings are built out of them because it was a cheap building material, like this church here. But you go inside, and there's this outcrop of limestone, and it's Mensa Christi, which is Latin for the table of Christ. And it's believed traditionally that this rock was where Jesus built the fire and cooked the fish that we just read about, and then served his disciples a meal. So that's what that is revered as, that site. Again, this is a chapel more than a monastic church for a community. This is just a chapel, so a place of prayer, not a place with a congregation. So you don't see all the architectural elements we saw at the other church. You do have an apse and an altar, but it's
Thomas, is there a congregation at the multiplication church?
it's a monastic church. So it's considered the church, like at Mebkin Abbey. They don't call it the chapel; they call it the church. It's considered to be the church, the local church for the monks who live there. Same thing at Church of Multiplication. Interestingly, you see everything written in like 5 languages: English, French, Arabic, Hebrew, whatever that language is. All right, so that's the Sea of Galilee and the pastor of the IOP standing in it. I have a thing with bodies of water. Anytime I go anywhere with a famous river or lake or something, I like to stand in it and have my picture made. So that's me standing in the Sea of Galilee. But I did that to make some humor. But also, this is standing at the beach by the Church of the Primacy of St. Peter, looking out onto the Sea of Galilee. So it just kind of gives you a sense of if you were the disciple looking out onto the Galilee, this is what you would see. Or if you were Jesus looking 100 yards out and saw some of your disciples fishing, this is what you might have seen. Well, it was night, it sounds like, but this is what you would have seen. And you can see this is roughly looking north to south. So see, you can see across it, but you can't see the end of it. That kind of hopefully can give you a sense of the scale of the Sea of Galilee. Next door to that, just around the corner, is Capernaum. Now Capernaum is nobody lives in Capernaum anymore, but it is one of the most well excavated and preserved archaeological sites you'll visit. And that's because of the era in which it was excavated. It was undisturbed until modern archaeologists were able to come in and use modern archaeology tools to excavate it. This is an aerial view of the excavated site now. See, this is the office building, and it's made out of that same limestone as the Church of Primacy of St. Peter. And you see the ruins in the ground, the foundations in the ground. This is an artist's rendering of what it may have looked like. It's from the opposite way. This is looking from the sea. This is looking toward the sea. But a couple things I'll point out from the aerial view is there's a stand right here that sells fresh squeezed juice that if you're hot and need some natural sugar and natural thirst quenched, I can't recommend those guys highly enough. That's the first thing I'll point out to you. But what you see in both of these, this big structure in the middle is the synagogue. And this is the partially reconstructed ruins of the synagogue here. Now what makes Capernaum noteworthy is that this was, as we talked about a minute ago, this was Jesus' home base after he left Nazareth. So if you think about it on the map, man, this is so little. Wait a minute, I'm not going to find it. You think Jesus traveled from Nazareth to the Sea of Galilee. He got to Capernaum, which was basically the first main good-sized town he would get to. And there he met his first disciples and called his first disciples. Matthew 9:1 calls Capernaum Jesus' quote, own city. So even though it wasn't his hometown, Jesus very quickly came to be associated with Capernaum. And people probably thought of him as being a resident, a citizen. Not citizen wouldn't be the right word historically, but Capernaum was where he was from now, even if it wasn't his hometown. So anyway, I just wanted to put that's what Capernaum was, and Capernaum was an important, even though it was not huge, using the word city is pretty generous, but it was an important economic center, particularly for fishing. And also it seems to be olive oil making at the time. So this is some of the ruins. This is an olive press. They had 3 kinds of olive oil they'd use one for cooking, one for ritual purposes, and one for lighting. And they the ritual purpose one was the most pure, the one for cooking was in the middle, and then the one for lighting was the least pure. And so they actually burned oil in their lamp. So you think of that little Jesus lamp? It burned on olive oil. I brought one back from the Holy Land, got the more expensive olive oil out of the pantry, and it worked. And then leaked, but that's another story. So this is an olive press that would have been there. This is some more of the ruins of the town that were there. This is a wall. This is not part of it. This is a modern wall, and you can just see here the partially reconstructed synagogue. What makes the synagogue so noteworthy? This was the synagogue for the town where Jesus lived. Jesus worshipped in the synagogue. Therefore, Jesus worshipped in this synagogue. That is a syllogism, by the way. So, more ruins. This is the beginning of what archaeologists believe to be a complex that was Peter's house, the Apostle Peter's house. The reason they think that this, and we'll see what's over here in a minute, but the reason they think this was Peter's house is it appears, archaeologically, they can tell what the house is being used for. And around the year, I wrote it down, in the middle of the 1st century, the house went from being, it seemed that part of it at least, and then maybe the whole complex, because think of a house at this place in time was not one roof with a bunch of rooms, but rather a complex of outbuildings and main buildings. But the purpose of this changed, and it was not being used as a house, but it was maybe being used as a place of gathering for worship. So if you're in the town place where Peter's from, where Jesus had his ministry, it would sort of logically follow that this may, very possibly, as close as we can say, this was Peter's house, based on the change in what archaeologists found when they excavated it. This is the synagogue. Now, these are columns that were from the synagogue, but obviously they were falling down. So you see partially reconstructed. And this is a very fancy synagogue, which means Capernaum was probably more prosperous than some of the towns around it. The synagogue we see is later than Jesus, but even though it's fancier, you still see the same thing. You've got one end where you would have had the scroll would have been read and preaching would have happened, and it would have been only men. And then there's a bench that runs around the edges where the men would have sat for prayer. But they also would have sat there for meetings. Beside the synagogue, there's what we might think of as the sanctuary. There's a second room. Think of it sort of as the fellowship hall. But it's another multi-purpose room. So synagogues served a dual purpose, even as they do today. It's a place of worship, but it's also a sort of community center. It's also a school for children. Boys, sorry, they didn't really bother with girls, but boys would have been brought here to learn to read, to learn the prayers. So in the ancient times, it was only boys. So it served a more holistic purpose. Now, the reason this picture is up here, you see this darker stone and this lighter stone? This darker stone, this synagogue was built on the foundations of the one from Jesus' time. And these darker stones are the foundations from Jesus' time. So I reached over and touched them when nobody was looking. But I'm sure I'm not the only person to have done that. But so you can kind of get a sense of what a nicer, more prominent, prosperous synagogue might have looked like. Still in a small town. Okay, so one end of the building that was Peter's house. This is another reason we think that it may have been Peter's house. One end of the building in the 5th century was knocked down and a church built in its place. And these are the ruins of that church. It's a small church. not unlike the Church of Beatitudes, where you have sort of an octagonal, I want to say it wrong, octagonal structure that would have probably had a central altar. But these ruins date from the 5th century and are at one end of the complex that we believe to be Peter's house. So if you had a house that changed purpose and then a church that was built where the house was, again, it's getting at the idea that something noteworthy must have happened there. And that gives further evidence that it was Peter's house. By the way, if it was Peter's house, it was probably also where Jesus was living while he was in Capernaum. Now, this is not a UFO, but it kind of looks like one. This church was built in the 80s. I forgot to write it down. But it is a church that is built on these pylons, but so it completely hovers over the ruins of the 5th century church. And it has one of the best views because it mimics the sort of worship in the round of the original 5th century church. So that doesn't do it justice, but this is the altar. But you have windows on every side, so you look out over the Sea of Galilee all the way around. And then the seating is on benches, not unlike in the synagogue, that are raised sort of bleacher style that go all the way around it. Now this is super cool. This is a big glass floor that you can't walk on, so I guess it's not really a floor. It's a floor, window, whatever. But it looks down, it looks down onto the ruins of the 5th century church. So when you're worshiping here, it's worshiping in the home of Peter. It's as close as you're going to get, unless you sneak under there and have some preaching and singing and stuff. But this is, to me, that's just, and you see in the artwork around in the wrought iron around the rail, can you see the pattern of the P and the high row? The letter P looks like a P is a rho in Greek, and the X is chi. It was an ancient abbreviation for Christ. You see that worked, and then you also see the alpha, the omega. Jesus referred to him as the alpha and omega, the beginning and the end. So you see that worked into the working there, and a mosaic in the altar that's just phenomenal. This is a Franciscan place for sure. I remember that. That's a closer up image of the Orthodox Church at Capernaum, honoring the same thing the one 10 or 50 yards over does, that you can't tour. But that just, to me, is a beautiful building. So I showed you a picture of it. All the domes. Interestingly, I'll point this out architecturally. There's a symbolism, a theological difference in between Eastern churches with domes and Western churches with steeples. If you think about a Gothic cathedral with the soaring arches and the spires, it draws your eye up, right? Up toward heaven, where God is. But if you think of a dome covers everything. So instead of saying directing the eye up, it directs the eye down, usually to the middle of the dome, which is where you'll find the altar, saying God is here. So subtle difference in Eastern and Western architecture as it relates to Yeah, in Russia you'll find that. And the onion domes in Russia are all like onion domes instead of domes like this because the snow wouldn't run off of domes like this. They made onion domes in Russia for the snow to fall off of. I'm told it's cold there. We didn't go here, but this is Mount Hermon, which in the Golan Heights, which is the site of the Transfiguration. You can see it from Capernaum. This is not from Capernaum, but this is the best picture I had of it. So this is Mount Hermon in the Golan Heights. It's on the border with Syria, so sometimes you can go there and sometimes you can't. But it's the traditional site of the Transfiguration. So right up here would have been where the Transfiguration happened. Now, to kind of put that in perspective for you on the map, this is the Golan Heights. So Israel did like this until 1967. And in the 1967 war, Israel took all this because in doing so, they captured the headwaters of the Jordan River and made sure that the Syrians were talking about building a dam here, and they could have just built a dam and shut down the Jordan River or controlled the flow in the Jordan River, and Israel would have been up a creek thirst-wise. So they captured the Golan Heights, and so this is all kind of carved out of Syria. And so we're over in this area now. So this is part of the Golan Heights. Now when I was there, we couldn't go into the Golan Heights, but we were able to go into the Golan Heights in 18. And we went to Caesarea Philippi. This is obviously an artist's representation of what it would have looked like. But Caesarea Philippi is in the Golan Heights. Quick history. So Alexander the Great conquered what we think of as the Holy Land in 332 BC. After his death, his generals sort of split up his empire among them, not always amicably. The Ptolemies of Egypt and the Seleucids of Syria were the sort of two powerful neighbors that were controlling those pieces of what had been Alexander the Great's empire. By the way, can y'all know the most famous Ptolemy? Can you think of a Ptolemy? Cleopatra.
Oh, yeah.
She was the last Ptolemy. So anybody who tells you, every once in a while there's a conspiracy theory that Cleopatra was Southern African. She wasn't. She was Greek. She was neither Egyptian nor Sub-Saharan African. She was Greek, which, probably still didn't make her look like Elizabeth Taylor. But, so Cleopatra was a Ptolemy. But the Seleucids were another Greek family that had inherited Syria. So you have the Seleucids here, you have the Ptolemies here, and remember we talked about how they actually called it the Via Maris, the way of the sea, where if you were coming from the further east in the Middle East to Egypt, you would come here at the Sea of Galilee, because this was hard to traverse, and then you kind of come down this way. So this was at the crossroads of east and west, even in the ancient world. It was strategically important. So at first, after the death of Alexander the Great, the Ptolemies of Egypt controlled everything that's now Israel. But in 200 BC, the Seleucids, around 200 BC, the Seleucids and the Ptolemies had a war, and the Seleucids actually became overlords of most of what's Israel. Now, you flash forward in time to the time of the Romans, and we're talking about the Golan Heights now, specifically. Caesar Augustus gave this area to Herod the Great, who left it to his son, Herod Philip, who built Caesarea Philippi in the Golan Heights. And it's not on the Galilee, it's further off. So Caesarea Philippi, he named it for Caesar and himself, because he was, I guess, not so modest. Thought it wouldn't know he named a town after himself if he also named it for Caesar. But what's interesting archaeologically here is the Grotto of Pan and what's called the Panion, which into this cliff face that's still here, niches and shrines carved out of the stone. And the grotto or cave is still there and was believed to be sacred to the Greek god Pan. There's also so in this here is would have been a temple that Herod Philip built to Caesar. Remember, they worshipped Caesar as a god, so not a very sort of minor god, but so a temple to Caesar, temples to Pan, and what's noteworthy here, we won't read it, but Jesus visited here. You see it in Mark 8. Beginning in verse 27, after the death of John the Baptist, Jesus and the disciples left the area that was controlled by Herod Antipas, probably because he had John the Baptist killed. We don't know if they were kind of running from the law or if they just wanted to change the scenery. And they went to the villages around Caesarea Philippi. So this was Herod Philip's capital. Jesus would have been here. Jesus would have seen this. And it was here that Jesus asked Peter in Mark 8, who do you say that I am? And some say John the Baptist, some say Elijah, but who do you say that I am? You're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And again, back to Peter, Jesus said, you're right, and your faith is I name you Peter, and you'll be the rock on which I build my church. This happened at Caesarea Philippi. It's noteworthy, I think it's remarkable to think that this happened in a place where a hostile ruler, who was Philip, who was not Jewish, but was given overlordship over Jewish people in their homeland, who built a temple to a man, military and political leader, and to the pagan god Pan, who at one point they think was worshipped with human sacrifice. Jesus made that happen in this place. There's something in that. This is what it looks like today. I use this picture in particular because I wanted you to see how green it was. Now there's springs there, and so that explains the lushness. But if you went the time of year we went, it was not this green. But I wanted you to see that even in the north of the country, it is very green certain times of the year. This is the cave that you saw the temple in front of. So, right there. That's the cave. And they believe they would actually, it's kind of silted up now, but it was deep. And they believed that maybe it was the mouth to Hades. And they would throw sacrifices into the cave. And you just... animal or human, either one, would die when they hit the bottom. Probably. This is one of the niches this architecture that would have been like a little shrine with statues or idols in them. And there's a zoomed out picture. You can see the excavated foundations of temples, a bigger niche. And if you walk around, you see there's little niches everywhere. You see the cave better. That's it. We're at the end. Then we went and had supper that day.
Good idea.
All right, so next time we'll talk about some other things around the northern part of the country, including Nazareth. Are there any questions or anything you have before we go?
On the Mount of Beatitudes, what was that? Okay, one was the feeding of the 5,000, but what about the feeding of the 3,000?
4,000.
4,000.
They think it happened somewhere on the other side of the Sea of Galilee. There's a site, but it's debated which site it is.
Okay.
And so one way that theologians have thought about it is this was the Gentile side, the cities of the Decapolis. I mean, the people over here on the eastern side most of them weren't Jewish.
Okay.
So the idea was it gets at the inclusive nature of Jesus' gospel. He fed everybody. So it was a separate miracle.
But you don't think it was two, it was just one story and then made into two. There were two events.
A lot of New Testament scholars would say it was one event with two tellings. In the same way you have two creation stories in Genesis.
Right.
I would say he fed them. When it comes into the stuff about Jesus, I'm almost a biblical literalist. I mean, I'd be willing to take a metaphorical reading of the Old Testament real quickly, but when it comes to stuff about Jesus, I'm like, nah, he really got up and he really walked out of the grave and he really said this and he really did that.
Yeah.
There's not much room for metaphor. I mean, that's just me.
Yeah.
I think it was two stories. I think it was two events.
Okay.